5 after. I think I'm going to go ahead and start and just let people join in. So I am going to start with this PowerPoint, and I'm going to try to keep this fairly short so that we can just talk. I have some questions at the end of the PowerPoint, or I can stop it and we can talk in the middle of it. It's just not that formal. So let me share my screen. And I'm going to put it in slideshow. That way, if anyone is eating lunch, you can just eat your lunch. And I think you don't, you're not so visible. Do you see each other down the right-hand side, or you only see the PowerPoint?
I see each other.
People.
Oh, great. Oh, good. I'm glad.
I see both,
Sometimes
yeah.
it's the other way. Great. All right. So just some building blocks. So I'm a biblical scholar, not Amy, you don't know me. So, but that's the work that I do. That's what makes me kind of interested in this. And so there are a couple of building blocks that I think from biblical studies that could be helpful. One is this way that I use for interpreting pretty much any narrative in the Gospels. This always works. So it helps if I talk first about just our daily lives and how they take place in these three frames. And then we'll talk about the scriptures and how they relate to the three frames. So, we have our personal lives and stuff that happens there. So recently, last spring, my husband had a heart attack. And yes, at the personal level, there's a lot of stuff going on with us, how we relate to each other, how we relate to doctors and nurses, our very personal level interaction with all of those people. But at the same time, we were very much enmeshed in a social and political situation because the healthcare situation really affected absolutely everything. Every piece of access that we could have to care is governed by a much larger frame that we are embedded in. Things that doctors are allowed to do, what we're going to end up paying for this. And we have quite good healthcare. We still felt it restricting us at times, and we had to be sure that absolutely everything was going to be covered. So we had a lot of work to do, but we were also really heavy-hearted about all the people who don't have that kind of access to healthcare. And in a way, that's like the springboard to like the theological frame. What is God doing here? So God is actually all the frames affect each other. All of them are active all the time. And the theological frame is the one that we're after, I think, in preaching to help people discern how and where God is present. And we felt God at these different levels. So God really present with us, and our also discerning how we relate to each person we're around in light of our faith in God. Like, how do we as disciples of Jesus treat all the people around us in, this thing that's happening to us in the hospital? And we also, because we're citizens of a nation that's democratic, we have responsibilities in the social and political realm. So becoming very hyper aware of the healthcare situation, as disciples of Jesus, as people who believe in a God of justice, we have responsibilities in that social and political realm based on experiences that we have at the personal realm. Like that can awaken us to things that are happening in this larger arena, and also open us to see where the power of God is being channeled well through social and political structures, and where it's being thwarted by social and political structures. So I think the three frames, like, they're partly just about life. This is how life happens. Scripturally, this might be clear. Well, I'll talk about it a little bit, and then I have an example. So I think very frequently, well, the stories in the New Testament, I'm really mostly talking about the Gospels right now. The Gospel narratives show mostly stories at a very personal level. And I think that's a trap for preachers, because if you stay at the personal level, I think that's why we tend to spark either stories about miracles. Oh, Jesus did a miracle here in this personal level for this person. Um, or we give psychological interpretations. Oh, this is what this person is feeling, or and we sort of will use that expertise that we have from our time. That's not really appropriate for the first century. That's not how the writers were thinking of it. Or we might try to explain the miracle away using scientific information. Oh, this it looks like a miracle, but it's really this thing that I can explain to you psychologically. Um, or I had some other thought about what we often do. Oh, medicalized interpretations. And so we will try to explain what's going on in the story and how, oh, well, they didn't know what we know about medicine now, so they were doing this or that. But I think by staying in the personal frame, we actually miss a whole level of meaning that the stories are intended to convey. Because Jesus is God's prophet, like this is one of his identities. He's always operating at the social and political level, and the stories are always sparking that. That's why he got crucified, because stuff he was doing really was seen as very provocative to the social and political situation. I'll give a story in a minute that will highlight that. And whether or not God is a character in the story, sometimes God is a character, or God is very clearly explained as acting. God is present very powerfully in all of these stories. Again, it sort of calls the audience to discern how God is functioning in the story, or is God being thwarted in the story, which happens. So this is kind of a basic framework that I use for biblical interpretation. I use it a lot for discerning what's going on in ordinary life. Any thoughts or questions before I move to apply this to a story?
I'll just mention that I'm taking EFM right now.
Oh yeah, great.
Third year, and this is very much theological reflection. Like we do this. I love this picture.
Yes.
Can I share this with Harvey Roberts? He's our teacher.
What's that?
Can I share this picture with Harvey Roberts? He's our teacher.
Yeah, let me see. I have to stop sharing my screen. Are you going to share your screen?
No, I was
Oh,
wondering
you
if I
want to
should,
share this?
if I
Oh,
could
yes,
just
you
take
may
a
share this
screenshot.
picture. Oh, of course. Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
okay. And because
Please, please,
he'll appreciate it, because this is
please
what
do.
we do on these
Yeah,
TRs all the time.
great.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. So, a very clear, I mean, I could choose any story, honestly, but this sequence in Mark 6 is, I think, one that everybody's familiar with. Herod's banquet, during which John the Baptist is beheaded, followed by the feeding of the 5,000. So Herod and all the people at that banquet, they, in a way, they really function in that social and political realm. So it's a personal story, but all of those people, you really can't understand what's going on at the dinner party if you're not paying attention to the social and political realm where they operate all the time, because Herod is afraid of what his courtiers might do. His wife only has very roundabout kinds of power. Like she wants to get rid of John the Baptist. She can't do it straight away. Once Herod watches the daughter dance, and you have this sense of all these drunk men watching this young girl dance, and she uses that. Like people, every instance of power happening in that banquet is twisted and is corrupt and is dangerous, and everybody's afraid of somebody else in the picture. Like it's a thoroughgoing picture of power gone wrong. So the power of God works in really different ways, and that's why the feeding story paired with it shows you what power does when power is working well. And so let's just go to the feeding story. It raises the question, what Jesus is doing here as a prophet is making clear that people who live in this very fertile land shouldn't be hungry. Something is going wrong at the social and political level if you got 5,000 people and they are all hungry. Like, it's not just that they've been there all day. That's where I think the staying at the personal level of the narrative can really distract you from what's actually happening in the story. Because people will often say, oh, they've been listening to Jesus all day, so they got hungry. But it's much more than that. They're hungry every day. They're hungry all the time. The reason they came to listen to Jesus was maybe he'll have some solution to what's going on here. So what Jesus gives in his preaching and feeding is wisdom for how to live in this very difficult time. And he also actually feeds them. Like, the power of God won't be stopped from feeding the people. The people need to be fed, and they get fed. And that, I think, also is kind of this back and forth with the disciples. Like, the disciples don't get it. Like, the power of God is available, can be channeled for setting things right and being sure that hungry people are fed. And they need to have confidence in that can happen, that can actually happen. Questions about that at all? I think it's a place where you can see how the three frames get us out of kind of old ways of reading some of these stories and into something that really has traction in our own time and place. Living in Los Angeles, I see a lot of hungry people all the time. And so it's very much in my face in that sense that these people shouldn't be hungry. Like, that's the point of the story. I'm not going to dwell for a long time on these other slides, but we can send you the PowerPoint if you want any more of this stuff. But I just wanted to raise up the question of citizenship in relation to Jesus, because he's a citizen of a country that's being occupied by another country. And citizenship isn't really something in relation to Israel. You're part of the people of Israel. That's what citizenship consists of, but it's not a democracy. So we have really particular questions as people in a democracy that I think are important to raise. But Jesus does respond to his calling as prophet, Son of God, Anointed One. He responds to that to try to do what God requires of him in this particular social and political context. So he has political questions in front of him that he's responding to for the good of the people. And that makes us ask then, as his followers, what are we called to do? We actually are citizens. Paul is described as being a Roman citizen, but we don't really have any hard evidence that he was a citizen. I think it's a really good question. Was he a Roman citizen or not a Roman citizen? But he works among people who are largely not citizens. And I think Philippians is a great letter to go to see what Paul has to say about that. Philippi had been resettled after the town was destroyed in a battle. It was resettled by Roman military veterans who just took the land from the native Greek-speaking populace. And they became small business owners, those who had the means to do that, and never had the kind of wealth that they had when they owned land. So Paul really uses language of citizenship there. Apparently it's a big deal. Even the fact that his letters are in Greek, not Latin, tells you that he's working among people who are largely not Roman citizens. So he says our citizenship is in heaven. It's interesting, from where we're expecting a savior, and that he's contrasting them to people who are citizens of that place. And then he uses this really interesting verb. The translation is live your life, but really it says conduct your citizenship in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. I think that's a really interesting question for us as we go toward these elections. What does it mean to conduct our citizenship in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ? And he says gospel of Christ because he wants to put together his view of Christ as the one who emptied himself on behalf of others. So I think it's really important to have the whole phrase gospel of Christ when we think about what Paul has in mind here. So questions about any of that? as I said before, I think it's really important to regard the kind of citizenship we have as an empowerment for us. It's a channel that God can work through that people didn't have in the first century, or largely didn't have it. Most of the people we're going to encounter in the New Testament don't have that. I just really want one thing from this slide, and that is, well, Israel's long history of occupation by other countries. They almost never were under home rule. So they developed patterns of accommodation and resistance, and they have a lot of practices of resistance against these other nations that we might think of as purely religious practices. So Sabbath keeping is an act of resistance because everybody else had to work 7 days a week if they were working people, and they were able to say, we don't do that. And they were largely given space to carry out that practice of resistance. Their dietary laws are acts of resistance. You know, we have our own way of life. It's different from yours. But I think that Jesus really critiques a lot of the leadership of his own time as accommodating too much to Roman culture, Roman practices, Roman morality, and not grasping enough this quality of resistance that there can be in Jewish religion, that God's, especially at the large scale, God's mercy and justice, like embodying God's mercy and justice in the world is, like more active resistance than a lot of the leadership felt like they could do if they were trying to be responsible to their families and hold on to their well-being. And I think accommodation, this concept of accommodation and resistance could be really important to us right now. I see people really asking that question of what does our faith require of us in terms of accommodating others and getting along well with others, and where does it ask us to resist what's going on around us? And it's very, very hard. I feel very sympathetic to the people Jesus criticized in his own time, because I think they were honestly trying to do what they felt was required of them in terms of responsibility to their families. And, they were kind of staying at that personal frame, and their responsibilities at the personal level outweighed their responsibilities at the social and political level. And that is really, really a difficult place for any of us to be. Then I have a few slides about Jesus as prophet, which I think you all are pretty familiar with. We probably don't need to dwell on that. Right now we're in the year of Luke, so I think it's really important just to see the resonance for Luke of this understanding of Jesus as a prophet. And Luke really sets up the political situation very clearly, just the way it's set up in the prophetic literature. So, the vision of Isaiah, son of Amos, and it tells you about who the kings are. And then in Luke, in the days of King Herod of Judea, or here we hear about a decree went out from Emperor Augustus when Quirinius was governor of Syria, or the 15th year of the reign of the emperor. So all of this stuff is intended, like we usually preach on that very much, but it's a really important marker for that whole social political frame. Like that's the frame. Luke wants you to know what the frame is, and then he tells these stories that work, kind of spark against that frame. So the last part I have here is just kind of looking at what the Revised Common Lectionary sets out for October. And I don't know, Liz and Stephen, whether you use the Revised Common Lectionary. You both do. Okay, great. So you're probably ready for Sunday, but this reading from Habakkuk is really interesting in our own time. this could be something that I would say, you know, how long shall I cry for help and you will not listen? I cry to you violence and you will not save. Why do you make me seeing wrongdoing and look at trouble? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. So the law becomes slack and justice never prevails. I mean, I just thought this is so resonant for us in our own time. And then the turn here at 2, I will stand at my watch post. And I thought, you know, that's really, I think, what discernment is about, is standing at the watch post, station myself on the rampart. I will keep watch to see what God will say to me, what God will answer concerning my complaint. And then God does answer and says, like, okay, now it's going to be up to you. Write the vision, make it plain on tablets so that a runner may read it, which apparently is a contested translation. But anyway, it's what we've got, so it's what we should work with. There is still a vision for the appointed time. It speaks of the end and does not lie. If it seems to tarry, wait for it. And I think our ability to put a vision of what God is doing in our time before people, like that's what I think is being pointed to here in Habakkuk. And then it ends with the righteous will live by their faith. And I just want to point to the gospel. The apostle said to the Lord, increase our faith. And Jesus replies, if you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say this mulberry tree be uprooted and planted in the sea and it would obey you. Like, they're not talking about personal things. I think, again, like the personal frame will really get us off because I think they're really worried about the times they're living in. He says, you know, really, I in all of the Gospels and also in Paul, I see a certain way of understanding human beings that I don't hear us talk about very much, but I think humans are seen as a channel, basically, for the power of God. You can channel through and faith is what makes the channel. So faith, it's not a set of beliefs that we hold, but it's being willing to make yourself a channel for the power of God to inspire you and move through you and be creative in the world. And I think that fits with basically a Greco-Roman view of how people have emotions and things. Like they channel them. Like you are not a nervous person. You might be channeling nervousness that's coming from outside of you, but you could refuse to channel that as well. So that I think that's an important way to think about faith here. It's not something to do, actually, it's making a space within ourselves that God can work through. But it takes community to do that, community so that you understand what that's like. You can discern God working through you versus other powers working through you. What are you all thinking as you go toward this Sunday?
I'm preaching on this Luke passage, and I'm actually backing it up to the verses
Yes.
for it, to the forgiving 7 times 7, which is what Jesus says, you know, how often do we have to forgive? And it's again and again, again and again. And so rooting this call, you know, so they're saying increase our faith in response to that of, so pointing to really like the weariness that is coming out of, and how do we draw on our faith when we're just tired of seeing the same systems in place again, the same patterns, and fighting the same battles and working for the same justice cyclically over and over. So what does it mean to be people of faith and to keep showing up? I haven't that's my later this afternoon is like finalizing it. And now I'm thinking of it like, oh, even in terms of political life and an election, and that is drawing that more forward is very helpful, because people are tired and they're weary, and it's like, really, we got to do this again.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm not sure what verb is being used there for forgive, but there's two of them that are used a bunch in Luke. It's probably one of the, it's either aphiemi or luo. It means to release. And
Mm.
I think that's really interesting to go from seeing forgiveness as this big work we have to do to, I need to let go. Sorry, my husband's talking downstairs. Can you hear him? Because I can, yeah.
A little bit, yeah.
I'm gonna put on my headphones and maybe that will minimize it. He has a very resonant voice. He's a singer, and that can be a problem. I'm gonna keep going here. That, by the way, that Habakkuk passage comes up again in a different track. It comes up in track 1. It comes up in track 2. Now it comes up in track 1 on October 30th. I kind of felt as though if you're going to do anything in which you actually talk about the elections, you might not even talk about them. Like you might be preparing the ground for folks without even bringing that up, because that might just cause a lot of anxiety that you don't need to invite into the room. You can think about that, but oh shoot, I know. It's too late. By October 30th, the elections, many people will have voted by mail already or done early voting. And so I kind of feel like if you want to say anything that's actually about the call of citizenship, you need to do it kind of early in October. So I was really trying to kind of look at some of these earlier readings to see what there might be. So, there's a beautiful passage from Jeremiah on October 9th, seek the welfare of the city where you are in exile. In the sense that as people of faith, we may sometimes feel that we're in exile in our own land because we hold values that other people don't hold here. It's like being in a foreign culture sometimes. But also, and this goes with the theme of forgiveness, like you could really be thinking across all of October about how we relate to other people who hold different views from ours. The story of the 10 lepers, it's only the Samaritan who turns around and says thanks. And like, do we label people so fast that we don't have a chance to see what's really going on with them? That's where I think this relationship between the personal and the social, political, and theological are important, because at the personal level, we can sort out some of these things. It takes much more imagination and perseverance, I think, to maintain a sense that a whole group of people who believe very differently from the way we believe, or hold very different values, that if we were to ask them each individually, why do you think what you think? How do you get there? We might find a lot of different things going on. And this is another way in which I think the 3 frames are kind of interesting for our time. I was talking to, I think it was Ingrid from Holy Trinity, and Jesse and I asked her, like, how are you maintaining a sense of hopefulness right now after all that Minneapolis has been through and that they are going through with their neighborhood? And she said, every day I try to have a few conversations, just one-on-one with people, because that really gives me life, to just talk about what's going on, what people are thinking and believing and putting their lives into at this very personal level. And it made me aware of another stressor in our time, like a different way to look at a stressor that we know is a stressor. That in Jesus's time, those stories are told at the personal level, and we're intended to see how they spark the social political level, how they might inform it. But so much in our lives right now, the larger level of society and culture are a level at which we operate too much. And it's informing the personal level. It's really complicating and making divisions among us that wouldn't necessarily be there if we weren't using this whole frame of what these people think and how dangerous they are and what they're doing. And I think we might take a cue from the scriptures and actually let the personal level inform the social and political level more than we allow the social and cultural political level to inform the personal level. Does that make sense? On the 16th, the unjust judge and the insistent widow, again, we have that theme of faith. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? So if you hadn't talked about faith till everybody was nauseated about it, you could bring it up here. And thinking about faith as a calling, a particular calling for us to have. The 23rd, we have the Pharisee and the tax collector, which is another instance of not assuming things about someone else, not assuming our own righteousness. And I think this is a really important message in our own time. And justification is a matter of being in right relationship with God and neighbor. And I think we often hype it, as does the Pharisee. Being in right relationship with God is everything, and he downplays being in right relationship with neighbor. And yeah, how are we going to do that? It's incumbent upon us as Christians, and how are we going to do that in our time? But again, we've got this question of accommodation and resistance. So what are we called to oppose, and where are we called to mend a relationship? I mean, forgiveness doesn't mean just letting anything happen, because so many people will be hurt. So I think, I put at the end of this, getting beyond all or nothing in our discernment and taking the time and energy to carry out extended and repeated discernment in these areas. And then the last Sunday, Zacchaeus, we talked about the story of Zacchaeus at our gatherings. Amy, you would have missed that, but we talked about Zacchaeus climbing up in the tree, and basically by getting up higher, he kind of sees the social and political ramifications of what he's been doing. Really, he sees the damage he's done to his community. And then I think what I love in the opening to 2 Thessalonians is this pairing of faith, love, and hope. And I think if you have any of these conversations about what is faith, I think love or hope, like they're kind of a trinity. If you enter any of those doors, you'll hit the others. And I think people worry also a lot about having hope in our time. And you might enter the doorway of love and come to hope, or the doorway of faith and come to hope, without trying to go at hope directly. So I have these questions. I guess since we're a small group, we can just see each other. Maybe it's fine to leave the questions up. But I'd really like to know from you, what do you hope your people will view as their role as citizens? How do you hope they will view their role as citizens as they prepare to vote? Like, do you have hopes around that?
I've told the story before, but we had somebody who was working on a book come to Coal Camp, our little rural town, and interview some young adults about their views of faith and things like that. And she was asking them about, politics, kind of getting in the meat of things and why they chose this and why they voted this way. And then she asked the question, how did your faith shape those decisions? And I just kind of thought, well, that should be an easy question. And I looked over, and you could just see the wheels turning. And he said, I guess I've never thought of that.
Yeah.
And I went, you never thought of that? I mean, isn't that the whole point of what we're doing? That we can't even connect that these two things
Right.
that are such a big part of who we are. So for me, that was eye-opening, that something that just seems so basic and such a part of who we are is kind of this monumental epiphany for some people.
Yes.
And so I guess since then I've had in my mind, okay, how can I point to and try to connect those dots? I wrote down, you mentioned in Philippians kind of that politics word, meaning conduct your citizenship. I saw someone said that, politics literally means how we have life together.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about political, and it sounds like such a dirty word, but it's truly like how we live together. It's not, we've corrupted the word.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a lot of what I'm hearing and thinking about right now.
Thank you. I think that whole our learning about the separation of church and state mucks it up for us, because then we don't know actually how I conduct my citizenship, which is a certain kind of power that I have. How can I do that as a faithful person? I'm not trying to go against church and state. I don't want a theocracy, but it's going to inform how I use the power I have in the world in all kinds of ways. I think that's why people, like, they don't even think of it. They think it's off limits to think that way.
I started preaching on these themes last week with
Okay.
the rich man and Lazarus.
Yeah.
And really talked about how, in that parable, if we who are hearing the story are spending our responses to criticize the rich man and put all our energies into sort of belittling him, or how could he not know? And then do we even know Lazarus's name? Do we know Lazarus's story? Do we see how God is caring for Lazarus and calling us to also care and know Lazarus? And talking about how, and I named, when we're preparing to vote and preparing for this election, do we go into that saying, I'm not voting for them, this is who I'm against, I can't believe them, I'll do anything to keep them out of power? Or are we looking around and learning the stories of the people who are most impacted by votes and policies, and learning what their needs are and caring for them, and allowing that to inform how we vote and who we vote for, and how that will inform us when we leave, when we cast our vote, what we do next, regardless of what happens, how we'll continue that. So sort of is like, voting is one part of our call to community and our call to care, but it's not, it's one part of many, so we have to sort of keep it with all the other things we're called to do. It should be in line with them.
Yes. I love that. I love many things about what you said. And part of it is like, you have this life of faithfulness, and voting is a little blip in that life, but it's the through line in how we're treating people. And I really think it's important not to turn every gospel into this person against that person, Jesus against the Pharisees, the rich man versus Lazarus. Like, I don't think they're told with that kind of background. I think we have put that frame on the stories, and they're supposed to be kind of complicated. And most of us are the rich man. I mean, clearly, we have everything. We don't worry, really. Most people sitting in the pews are not worried about their day-to-day existence. And yeah. So I love the fact that you sort of broke down that black and whiteness that people tend to do also, and the setting of citizenship as just a daily kind of power that we might be exerting.
be curious to hear from you all how specific you get in preaching during election time like this. Like, are you naming names of local politicians or specific ordinances that are up, or keeping it more general? And I guess I could see pros and cons of each, and I think that's something that preachers in my life have wrestled with. Is like, yeah, what's maybe appropriate for me to say and what's not. But if I don't say it explicitly, then am I, not being prophetic enough? It seems very complicated to discern.
We do both, and I serve in a context that's very unified in their voting, very clear about what they say, and often my role is like, scale it back a little, guys. And still, so, and I feel like I'm careful not to endorse politicians, even if everybody's on the same, although if you look at my front lawn, that's very different from me as a private citizen. But we talk about issues that are on the ballot, justice issues, and we'll name, we'll sort of unpack and explore them without saying vote this way on that. And even in the unity, I feel like in our congregational tradition, there would just be an uneasiness of someone saying, this is how you should vote. They might we stop the line at like drawing attention to and talking about the dynamics or whatever is happening in it without saying vote. We'll talk about, so Michigan has a really important question on the ballot around abortion rights. And so we've certainly talked about abortion rights, and that is a faith topic. But we're not, in that case, we're not saying, here's how you need to vote on that initiative. So, but yeah.
Stephen, you're in a more mixed place and in a small town too, where everybody knows everybody.
It's not mixed. We're very unified in what we believe. Or I should say they are unified in what they believe. It's which is very different from us as kind of outsiders. So that's been a continued struggle for us as far as how am I preaching in a way that's not just trying to voice my opposition to everything they believe. So I certainly don't name anything very specific at all. Sometimes I feel like I'm being kind of a wimp for not doing that, but I also know just where people stand, where I stand. So how do you kind of bring those, make a connection of some sort?
One of the interesting things I see in your area is the way in which your church has become such a resource for the community. And people do know that you hold different political beliefs from theirs, I think, right? Like they're kind of aware of that. In that, whatever that way is, that people know things, they kind of know that. But they can't dismiss you because look at what you're doing. And so I think that's a really interesting witness. And if you look at what Jesus is doing, he's often, he's not talking about things directly. I think about something like the cursing of the fig tree. And, he does these dicey sort of prophetic things, like sort of theatrical things. I think the cursing of the fig tree is really related to the prophetic image of Israel as the fig tree. And at the present time, under its present leadership, it can't bear any fruit. Like it should be bearing fruit, but it isn't. And it's not bearing the fruit of justice. And so I think he has these kind of sly ways of making his critiques known, but they weren't so sly that the authorities didn't pick up on them either. Like they weren't so hidden. I think things like showing the candidates that you support, like it's so contextual. So I was in a big city and Liz is in a relatively large place. So I could put a sign in my yard. I wouldn't put a sticker on my car because then it would come to church and then it would be on church property and that would be a whole different deal. So that's kind of how I worked that out. But if Stephen were to put a sign in his yard, it would be like right in front of the whole town. Like, it would be very, very specific. So it's just so contextual what we can do. So what do you think are, I have some other questions here about other elements in the liturgy that you might use as we're sort of going toward the elections. There might be places there in which people's awareness could be lifted, but in a gentle way. What are other places like in the life of your congregation besides just preaching in which you might want to support people's discernment or sense of themselves as citizens?
In terms of liturgy, I was thinking of a prayer of confession, like before and after the election is maybe the time of the year we most need to confess our collective sins of spite and vitriol, and sort of draw us back towards humility and connection.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Sort of it's like plowing the ground up for any kind of forgiveness, a relationship, like trying to repair some of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of our confirmation program with kids who are in 7th and 8th grade, more than teaching the catechism or whatever, I try to get them to think, just, ask the question of why. Why do they believe this? Why do they act this way? And hopefully in that make them, kind of question and think about, maybe discern for themselves, even though they don't know that word maybe yet, but kind of think a little deeper than just following their parents or following their friends. But why are you acting that way? Or when you talk about elections, which they have, well, why are you talking that way? And what does it mean when you don't get to vote yet because you're not of age? So what can you do? So that's one place I can see it. Another place, when we have our triennial youth gathering nationwide, where people from all over come together to hear the same speakers. It's very, very, it pushes our folks out of their comfort zone, and it's gone both ways as far as bringing growth and then bringing angst as well. But I remember one of the highlights of my time here was the drive home and hearing these conversations in the back of the van of like really thinking differently about a lot of things, and being able for them to voice some things that they believe and that they may have not been able to say before. So so I like to try to use like youth formation times for that.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And there's hope in hearing like how they're talking and how they're thinking based on the questions that you asked. Yeah. It makes me aware too, just how what we're really talking about is thoroughgoing formation of people across all the parts of their lives in terms of how their Christian faith and Christian beliefs intersect with how they lead their lives as a totality. So citizenship is just a particular case of something you're trying to do across everything in people's lives.
Not so much preparing them to vote, but our church is a polling station, a polling place, actually for 2 precincts, one of which votes traditionally very differently than my congregation does. And it's sort of obvious and evident by the folks who come in and what they wear, and the folks who are outside and what they're encouraging people in line to do. And starting in 2016, we started providing hospitality for all the voters, and in recognizing after they voted and thanking them for voting, which I feel like my church is in such a bubble and intentionally, like we seek out this bubble, but to put, in our building, welcoming in folks who are not going to come on Sunday morning. And, but how can we meet and just say, thank you for being here today. Thank you for engaging in this thing that we're all engaging in, knowing that, and sort of just like, literally just being face to face with people that we would otherwise be very disconnected with has been powerful and started conversations around the just who's in our community, who are our neighbors, and what are the implications of that, and how do we live together?
Yeah, I love that. It's like it's a third space, and we talked about Herod's banquet and the feeding of the 5,000, and then you have this other, it's a kind of hospitality, feeding, welcoming space that you're doing. It's like the feeding of the 5,000. It's really beautiful, and across so many divides. I love that. Amy, and we're kind of getting toward the end. Any last thing you might want to add or ask anybody else? Or
No, I'm taking it that all of you guys are ministers. All of you, is that correct? You're
Jesse is a lay preacher.
okay. Are you all
I-
Episcopalian?
I am, but not Stephen, not Liz. So
Okay,
Lutheran and Congregationalist.
very neat.
And Amy's from St. Matt's.
Yeah, Kelly,
Local.
our rector, sent the information, so it sounded very interesting. So I know Jane, I've met Jane, from we have the skill sharing
Yeah,
community
that
of
was
calling.
so great.
Thank you.
I'm really glad you're here.
Yeah, you said you would send the information or the PowerPoint, or I
Yes,
just want
yes,
that
we
first
can-
slide especially, but
Yes, okay. Well, we'll turn it into a PDF so it can easily
Okay.
be transferred.
Sure.
Otherwise, it's too big to send very easily, but we'll send it.
and I like the I guess it would just be the translation of that word for politics and about this
Oh,
the,
yes. Mhm.
behavior of your citizenship or how you behave as a citizen. I like that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll say one last thing about the three frames that I didn't say before, and that is, I think, a good metaphor for that. I say three frames because I think about frameworks of interpretation, like that's how I work. But I think maybe a more apt, if you ever wanted to use it with people in your congregation, a more apt metaphor is like looking through a microscope. So you can have a single thing that you're looking at through the microscope. When you look at it at different magnifications, it looks totally different. Like so the very up close and then pulling back and then pulling back, it looks like a completely different object, but it's the same thing. And I think that's really important about these stories, that we're not importing an inappropriate framework for reading the story. It's there. It's already there. We're just changing the magnification by which we're looking at the story and hearing the story. So, all right. Thank you all so much for being here. You've given me a lot to think about. And as always, you give me hope as I sort of touch down with the faithfulness with which you were acting as leaders, the kinds of choices, the kinds of discernments that you make as leaders, the really astonishing faithfulness of that in the relationship between you and your people. It's just really gives me hope. So thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Yeah, and we'll send this recording out in the coming days.
Thanks.
All right, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.